Hello guys, and welcome back to another cold episode. On today's episode, as you can tell by the title and the thumbnail, I wanted to talk about the best decks in all of Yu-Gi-Oh! And where they would go in terms of how impactful they were in their history. Not necessarily where they would be, like, the most powerful in terms of all time. Because, honestly, the later that you go, the more powerful the decks are. Period. Right? Like, obviously, the most recent Tier 0 deck is going to be the best deck that has ever been printed, whereas the earliest one is not going to even hold a candle to even a modern Rogue deck. So, let's quickly talk about where each deck was historically, not just Tier 0, but nearing that Tier 0 status, and I have linked them chronologically here, up until Cashier. This is technically every single one of the archetypes. However, we're only going to be talking about these ones right here in this front row up until Tira. So, yeah, let's just quickly go through each and every one of them and talk about where they would be on the list of how dominant they were in their time period. First off here, we have, this is technically supposed to be Chaos Emperor Dragon / Chaos in, like, early 2000s. 2002 is where this would originally have started, and honestly, this is the start of Tier 0, the start of when cards needed to be banned, and the start of really seeing a dominant strategy come to fruition, and not just being a whole bunch of pile of good cards, but more specifically a strategy centered around specific cards and specific combos. Now, notably, this is still just a pile of good stuff, and all things considered, this was very dominant, but it's hard to really say how dominant it was just due to a lack of knowledge of that time period, knowledge of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Sphere in that time, because there wasn't as much that was recorded at that time. So really hard to say. I don't really want to put it in S tier, but it's very, very strong. Definitely one of the dominant strategies. Definitely like the only realistic thing that you could play at the time. Yeah, I mean, all of these were basically the only thing that you could play at the time. This or counters to it, and there weren't really many counters, but it's hard to say looking back if that were the case. Going back and like playing it, it really doesn't seem like it's all that powerful, and honestly I could see it even going down to a B, but we're gonna leave it at, you know what, I'm gonna put it in B. I don't really see it being all too powerful. Very good, but hard to really say otherwise. Next up we have Dad. I know, again, similarly, Armageddonite is being here instead of Dad, just because there wasn't a picture of Dad, but here you go. This is Teledad. Teledad was absolutely dominant everywhere. You basically had to play that. It was also super expensive. So again, it's hard to say whether people were playing the game at all during this time, if like this was actually due to how powerful the deck was or anything like that. However, to be fair, basically Dad was everywhere. You basically played Dad or you didn't play the game. So I'm going to put this one in A. It was everywhere, the card was everywhere, but there wasn't a specific build, which made it a little bit more, not quite S tier, I would say. But, I mean, most Tier 0 decks don't have a specific build, but, yeah, there we go. And in terms of its history, it was very, very, very dominant, very, very strong. Next up, we have Nekroz. Nekroz is very good overall, just a very solid deck. However, there was a lot of things that you could still do to play around it. While it was the best deck by far, there was still a lot of different decks that you could play. It wasn't entirely squeezing the entire meta out of the metagame, and you were still able to more or less convert with other decks. Also, there were various different builds that you could pilot and stuff like that. However, this one had the least flexibility, at least during its time period. Still insane, just, you know, locking your opponent out of the game with the Jin lock and stuff like that. Very good. Here we have our first S tier. Honestly, this is probably the best deck that has ever been printed during its time period. And the reason for that, Pepe was absolutely insane. It was legal for 5 days. 5 days. That's how overpowered it was. It was insanely fast to get hit. And to be fair, Nekroz wasn't around for that much longer either. It's not like it was around for multiple events. It was like one major event and then it was gone. But the difference is Pendulum, or more specifically Pepe, had an insane end board that basically made it so that it was like, on the week of its release, the only reason people weren't playing this deck, like legitimately, was because they couldn't find the cards. That was it. That was the only reason people were not playing this deck, was because they couldn't find the cards necessary to actually play this deck. That's how powerful it was. It was basically a 100% top cut 100% play rate. Like, everyone played this deck. It was that powerful. Emergency ban list. Most people dropped it immediately because it was that powerful. It was basically all mirror matches, and it really did change a lot of the ways that Yu-Gi-Oh! And modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Specifically was played. It changed it from being set 5 and pass, or like, you know, playing this like more control style deck, or like a slower mid-range style deck, to just like full out combo, vomit out your hand, get as many monster negations or just negations on the board as possible, and move on from there. So yeah, there you go. Next up, we have another insane tier 0. That being, this one's hard to put anywhere other than S tier. Zoodiac has been one of the best decks ever printed in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. There are still cards limited and banned. Dryden is at 1 in Master Duel, and probably can't go to more than 1 because of how powerful this deck is, even though it's literally just a face-up spell card destruction. Or a face-up card destruction. So, like, not exactly the greatest, but Broad Bull is banned. Can never really come back. Rapier, I believe, is at 1 currently in TCG and at 0 in OCG and Master Duel. There is no Barrage in any of the formats. Like, lots of cards are still limited and or banned because of how insanely powerful this deck is. And while it is fairly recent, it is 2017. So it's 5-6 years removed, and it's still insane. We definitely couldn't see it come off of the ban list for quite some time because of the way that this deck functions. I still don't think that during its time it was better than like Pepe, but it was still very, very strong and definitely very dominant. This one's harder to say that it's specifically because of its actual dominance during the time that it was tier 0, and more so for its dominance throughout Yu-Gi-Oh's history as a whole. Since its release, it has been a good deck, period. It hasn't been perfect, and it has definitely received more hits and stuff like that. In the TCG, it's basically unplayable right now because of a lack of Trident, but even in OCG and Master Duel, it's still playable due to having access to that Trident and due to Zeus and stuff like that, and being better as like a control deck and stuff like that. So it's still a very good deck, even to this day, which is crazy to think about. Next up, we have Spiral. Spiral was also one of the few decks that had an emergency ban list, and yeah, it's just hard not to put this also at S tier because of how absolutely insane this deck was on release. Well, more specifically with the release of Double Helix. Double Helix absolutely changed the entire way that you played the game with Spiral in particular. It basically made it just the strongest, most powerful deck ever at the time, and it was also emergency banned. That's how powerful it was as well, with things like Firewall Dragon being able to constantly loop, being able to just spit out your entire hand, as well as get an unbreakable board with multiple interactions, not just a negation and stuff like that. Spiral really was like the actual modern day Link deck that Pepe inevitably facilitated kind of idea. To be fair, this one dominated definitely more than Zoodiac, and was definitely very strong at its release. In fact, there were several instances where it was like 1 or 2 decks in Top Cut were not Spiral. That's how few it was. So, you know, there you go. There were several of those events as well. It wasn't something where it was like, oh, 1 or 2 of it. No. It was several of them. And then on top of that, it came back similar to Zoodiac, where it was, again, the best deck. After the release of Magician Souls, it became the best deck again. So it's not like it was ever bad again. And then they banned Masterpiece in the TCG, and then it was fine. But all things considered, this is definitely one of the strongest decks that has been printed. Sure, Dad was very good as well, but it felt like you still had options to play at least some other things, and were still able to kind of win just due to old Yu-Gi-Oh being more forgiving. Whereas in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, it felt like if you weren't playing Spiral or Pepe or Zoodiac, you just kind of weren't playing the game. So there's that. Next up, we have Sprite. Sprite was terrible. It was barely a tier 0 deck, but it was still tier 0. It was incredibly consistent. It was able to compete with even tier and stuff like that. But I still think that this is just genuinely, at the time of its release, one of the worst tier 0 decks. It was only tier 0 in the OCG. That was it. That was the only time that it was tier 0. It was never tier 0 in TCG. It was never that good. It just couldn't quite keep up with things like Tira or with other such strategies. It was good, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't that good. Moving on, we have Tira. Tira, when it was released, was, to be fair, Tira Laments is the best deck ever printed, period, hands down, no questions asked. This deck is insane. However, the difference is, in comparison to what else was released at the time, that being things like Sprite, which was also a tier 0 deck, things like Cashier, which came afterwards, or other such synchro heavy or combo heavy reliant decks, Tira honestly wasn't all that crazy. It was dominant, but only barely. It was tier 0, but again, only barely. You could still play Flunder, you could still play Exosister, you could still play Sprite, you could still play other various strategies that weren't specifically designed to beat tier, and just tech in cards to beat tier, which is something that most other decks weren't really able to do, or would basically stop with things like the Spiral and the Zodiac and what have you. It felt like you could actually play other things other than tier, but tier was definitely your best bet. So I'm going to put it clear down in C. I'm going to put it above Necros. I think it's better than Necros, but it's like, at its time, it really didn't shine all that much in comparison to a lot of these other decks. Now we're going to talk about the non-tier 0 decks, and they are going to just be right alongside all of these other ones. So you would think that they're all going to go on F. They're not. I'm going to kind of put them where I feel like they would, where they would belong. So next up we have True Draco. True Draco was absolutely insane when it was released. While it wasn't the best of the decks, it was still very, very powerful. So there you go. I don't really have anything else to say. It was just a very solid deck. It felt like you were either playing True Draco of some capacity or Zodiac, which is something to say. It's like, hey, Zodiac's also there. So it's one of those things where it's like, yeah, this deck absolutely could have been tier 0 had it not been stifled by other such insanely powerful strategies. And while I don't think it's necessarily like more powerful than something like tier, again, is more so in context. I do think that it is very, very powerful, and definitely one of the decks that is most deserving to be higher on the list. Next up we have this is basically Dragon Link. So there you go. There's Dragon Link. Hold on, we'll talk about that in a second. Dragon Link is as a deck, it never really received insane representation. It was more so the fact that it was consistently at the top, consistently either a tier 1 or 2 deck for just so long, genuinely. With the guard dragons being available, such as LP and Pisty and stuff like that, as well as all of the other myriad of just dragon strategies in general, dragons were very, very powerful. With that being said, it was just mostly their consistency and the fact that they were constantly at the top. I wouldn't necessarily say that they were ever dominant, and I don't think that they ever realistically could be dominant. They do lose to quite a few individual hand traps where if you are teching to specifically beat them, it does do quite a bit against them. So I wouldn't say that they would ever really be tier 0. We'll talk about that in a second. As I mentioned, Goki was quite powerful. I'm going to put it at the top of C tier. Goki was one of those decks that just kind of hand looped you. It was a deck that just kind of did everything. It played through multiple hand traps. It ripped all of the cards out of your opponent's hand and then just kind of hoped that your opponent couldn't play the game. And in all honesty, it basically made the game a very like, do you have the out kind of situation. It incredibly strong, very dominant, and in terms of the other decks around that time, there wasn't a whole lot that was more powerful than it. It definitely stamped its own name into the cosmos, if that makes sense. And it was definitely very, very powerful. I think there were a few other like combo-esque decks at the time that really did abuse things like the Topologic Bomber and stuff like that were just incredibly powerful. That really did facilitate not just Goki, but other such strategies. But Goki was far and above those, which made it that much more powerful in such a powerful metagame itself. Similar in nature to tier, except not as dominant. Next up, we have Halqifibrax. Halqifibrax is an absolutely insane card, and there were so many strategies that specifically centered around this individual card. There isn't any specific strategy. This is just more of like a, hey, this is a kind of pseudo strategy that was played basically everywhere, and similarly to like Adventure and stuff like that, basically had a tier 0 representation in terms of decks and profiles and stuff like that. Basically every deck played Halqifibrax, and basically every deck was able to facilitate some sort of Halqifibrax line, similar to Zodiac or True Draco in the past. So there's that. Next up, we have Cashier. Cashier is just an insane deck. Right now in the TCG, it basically is tier 0, and it is one of the most consistent winning decks. In order to like get you to top cut and stuff like that, you basically don't even have to play the deck in order to actually just top with it. That's how insanely powerful this deck is. And in a lower power format, as of right now in the TCG, as well as being able to compete with things like Tira, it truly is an insane deck. And it's one of those things where it's like, should I put it above tier? Not necessarily, but I'm going to, because it is such an absolute powerhouse for a top tier deck that isn't necessarily tier 0. Again, kind of judging this more on how good is this as a deck as a whole, not specifically as a tier 0 deck, but more so, hey, how much did this actually change? Yeah, it's just kind of hard not to put it that high. Though I do feel like I do need to put it down below tier. I'm going to put it up here in B tier. It just was an absolutely insane deck. And it still is, both in the TCG and in the OCG. It is still stuck around. It's just one of those strategies that's like never really going to fall out of favor unless you just absolutely nuke it. So there you go. Mostly due to a Rise Art. And then moving on, we have... This is supposed to be Dragon Lords or Elemental Dragons, as well as Spellbooks. I don't have Spellbooks because I don't want to try and find them, but I'm sure they're in here somewhere. I'd put both of these in A tier. While they weren't individually dominant enough to ever be tier 0, they both could have been. If one was released prior to the other, one would definitely have been tier 0, and the other one would have come along and kept it in check. Similar to Sprite and Tira, but not quite as different, right? Yeah, the Elemental Lords were the Elemental Dragons, aka the Dragon Lords, were absolutely insane. They basically have to remain on the limited list forever, because if they are released, they absolutely cause chaos, mostly due to Dragon Link, not because of actual Dragon Lords. But the more of them that there are, the more stuff that is able to be done, especially in a Link era where just getting bodies onto your field and generating more card advantage just kind of wins you the game in most instances, because you can go into powerful Link monsters like Apollosa and the like. We see that now with Super Heavy Samurai. But all in all, the Elemental Dragon or the Dragon Lords are absolutely insane and really did kind of usher in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! As we know it, right? That was when the game truly changed from like set 5 pass or like more control-esque strategies to I am going to vomit out cards onto the board and do stuff with them, like going into Draco Sec, going into Big Eye, or just sitting on like a Redox and basically, you know, knowing that your opponent can't really do much about it. A very, very powerful deck, both of them, and really did kind of change the entire metagame. There was basically nothing else that could even keep up with those two decks. Like there were a few other decks that kind of showed up and were like, hey, I'm also playable, but they were all only there because of basically really good players not being able to afford the insane power points or price points of the other two decks. So yeah, similar in nature, I think, to something like Dad. But there you go. That is my list. I know it's kind of weird. Realistically, if we were to actually take this into account, it would be more something like, you know, it'd be more something like this, where it's like, oh, actually all of the tier 0s just happen to be like this. But alas, well, that would be like that. But alas, you know, that doesn't look as cool. So, yeah. The tier 0s are very good. And then the tier 1s are decently good. But all things considered, given their time periods, yeah, it's hard to justify anything other than like Pepe, Spiral, and Zodiac being at the top there. These three were absolutely insane given their time period, and Zodiac, I would say, is probably the best deck that has the best tier 0 deck in terms of like its history, right? Tier obviously is the best deck ever printed because it's the most recent, but like realistically, Zodiac has more history to it, and therefore is probably is like the best deck ever printed, in terms of like, well, it was good clear back then, and then it was still good when it was limited, and then it was still yada yada, and so there you go. Anyway, that's it for today's episode. I hope that you guys did enjoy it. If you did, I like this very much, so appreciate it, and if you want to check out more content like this as well as more Yu-Gi-Oh, then just be sure to subscribe. And thank you guys so much for watching, and remember to always stay frosty. Bye bye. shout out to the Frost Guard, my members. Thank you guys so much for the support, and I hope you enjoy the content.